Morning, everybody. Just a sound check for you guys. Thank you for joining in. We're just admitting many people into the meeting, and we will be with you in a few minutes' time. Looking forward to another great event hosted by Unitrans. So we'll keep you posted. The sound check to everybody. Good morning. For people joining the session, we're just admitting more colleagues into the event.
Good morning, Harry. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can hear you. Good morning.
Perfect.
Good morning. See, it's nice people meeting and greeting each other in the chat room. Thank you for joining the session today. We're looking forward to a great event. I'm still admitting people into the event, and we're going to start in a few seconds. All right, good morning, everybody. Been looking forward to this great event being hosted by Unitrans Supply Chain Solutions this morning. Yet still admitting people into the event. But while we're doing that, just quickly some housekeeping, and we would like to give recognition to our sponsors and our stakeholders of the Transport Forum making this possible. Let me share my screen quickly that we can have a look at our program. So there we are. It's 25th of August 2022, talking about sustainability in transport. And we couldn't have had a better MC than Liesl de Wet today, who's going to be our MC. Thank you, Liesl, for supporting us and agreeing to do this for us today. We're really looking forward to being MC'd by you today.
Awesome. Thanks, Harry.
So, ladies and gents, just some housekeeping. Please remember to keep yourself on mute. When we have questions and answer sessions, then we will allow you to unmute and ask a question once you've been recognized. That we will handle when we get there. Now, the Transport Forum, as you are aware, all our initiatives are complementary to the public, including the related content on the web. So there must be somebody who's making this possible for us. And we would like to give recognition to all these organizations who's making the Transport Forum possible. And that's more than 15 years already. We've been running this, and the Transport Forum became one of the strongest platforms for communication in transport in South Africa. And these sponsors and alliances made it possible for us. So let's give some recognition. But there's going to be fun in this process. So you should listen carefully what I'm telling you. And because we're going to ask questions about our sponsors, and 2 people can win 2 prizes. You can see it's a very nice Transport Forum branded power bank, and a very nice little cute little lantern that you can win should you answer the questions correctly. All right, so that's going to be fun. And you can just change my screen here. There we go. All right, so listen carefully, and you might win one of these 2 prizes. So we've got formal alliances with the Transport Forum. That's professional industry bodies who are part of the Transport Forum and formally associated with the brand. Obviously, there are many others as well, participating, but these are in a formal relationship with the Transport Forum. So let's start off with the African Road Industry Association. And as we usually do, anybody from these organizations are welcome to interrupt me when I put up the slide to say a few words about the organization. If nobody is there, then I will just continue and say a few words myself. So ARIA, it's African Road Industry Association. They're doing huge work in third-party access and uplifting the deteriorating road infrastructure in South Africa. And Seeland Law was the CEO there. They're doing great work, and we should support them. And thank you for your formal alliance with the Transport Forum. Then we have the Road Freight Association. I don't know if there's somebody from RFA want to say a few words. Freight Association, you can see the slogan is "Without trucks, South Africa stops." Talk about green, smart, safe, legal, and all about freight and road freight. Thank you, Kevin Kelly and team, for supporting us. We really appreciate your support. South African Bus Operators Association. I don't know if Basil want to say a few words.
Morning, Ari. Hello, everybody, and wishing you well today on this event. Yeah, thanks. Everybody should know about Sabawa now, but just a reminder, and I think you will be publishing today our communications for the Sabawa AGM, which the broader Transport Forum associates are welcome to join, and looking forward to seeing you all at the AGM to learn more about Sabawa. But as you have it up on the screen, Sabawa is actively involved in the public transport sphere, and we are desperately trying to transition the industry, and we look forward to an imminent engagement with the minister, and we'll communicate that. Thanks, Harry.
Thank you, Basil. Thank you for your guidance and mentorship to myself as well, and supporting the Transport Forum. We really appreciate it. South African Association of Freight Forwarders. You can see already established in 1921. National Association of members throughout the Republic of South Africa. So its members make a major contribution to facilitating trade within South Africa. So the member companies manage over 80% of South Africa's international trade. So you, in that space, you definitely also need to be a member of the South African Association of Freight Forwarders. South African Express Parcel Association. There's somebody from SAPA want to say a few words, perhaps. The represented body and the voice of the express delivery industry in South Africa comprises of member companies engaged in express freight and courier industry. SAPA is a representative of service providers throughout the express supply chain. Thank you, Gary Marshall and team, for your support. The Chartered Institute of Logistics and Transport South Africa, it speaks for itself. Say they are a leading international professional body for everyone who works within supply chain, logistics, and transport. Thank you, SILSA, for your great support. We also have media houses, formerly part of the Transport Forum. And these are Freight News, Railways Africa Magazine, and Engineering News. So we've got Freight News. They've been part of the Transport Forum since inception, actually 15 years ago. So there's somebody from Freight News who want to say a few words. They're talking about established, innovative, effective, founded already in 1953 by John Marsh. It continues to be run as a family business by Dave and Anton. So all about logistics news, ladies and gents. You should subscribe to this. If you're not subscribed to this, then you're definitely losing out big time. Railways Africa Magazine is the African continent specialist trade, technical, business-to-business online publication covering all aspects of the rail sector. So it's all about rail infrastructure, and it's so important today in our world of rail that this should be supported and subscribed to. Engineering News, somebody from Engineering News, perhaps. You see, they are a premier source of real economy news, daily coverage of South Africa's transport and automotive sectors, accurate and timely news reportage. Thank you, Creamer Media, for your support. Seatrack, somebody from Seatrack to say a few words. Besides my friend Basil, I'm doing all the work again today. Seatrack, ladies and gents, is a platinum sponsor of the Transport Forum. And they're leading global software as a service provider and big data company for vehicle tracking, fleet management, and insurance telematics solutions. It's always visible, making everything always visible, so important. Thank you, Seatrack, for your kind support. Unitron Supply Chain Solutions. Diesel, I don't know if you guys want to say a few words quickly about Unitrons now.
No, Harry, I'll talk about it when I open up this morning.
Thank you very much. Unitron is also a gold sponsor of the Transport Forum. Thank you, Diesel. Looking forward to that. Department of Transport Supply Chain Management of University of Johannesburg, Prof. Jackie, Prof. Nalin, Prof. Rose Luke, they've all been part of this Transport Forum since the start, also mentoring myself quite a lot, and definitely a place to be should you want to know more about the logistics industry. They say excellent qualification provides scarce skills and facilitate career development in an important industry. All right, so on behalf of the Department of Transport Supply Chain Management, we encourage you to travel smart and plan your journey with us, UJ. Thank you, UJ. Birthday cargo, somebody from birthday cargo, perhaps. Our sponsor also fulfills the needs of the express cargo industry for a daytime and overnight cargo capacity across a comprehensive footprint. Global Trade Solution. You can see what they're doing. They deliver innovative technology and consulting services to the international trade and supply chain community, imports and exports. So that also offers customs connect and consulting services. Louise Widget and team, thank you very much for your kind support. Also Marcel Ross, a lot of work supporting the Transport Forum. Right, and yeah, very interesting, ladies and gentlemen, we've got Ticket Pro Travel. Now, Ticket Pro Travel, they're an online booking tool. All right. So for all your corporate travel needs, you can use ticketprotravel.co.za, and they'll make sure that your business is taken care of in terms of, fraud or the best value for money when you do corporate bookings. And they also go sponsor of the Transport Forum, so let's support them. It's an excellent solution. You can see they're talking about no contracts, no hidden fees, just good business, straightforward, fair pricing. So very important, Ticket Pro Travel online booking tool. Thank you very much, Ticket Pro Travel. The same other company, Ticket Pro, they've got a Smart Tab solution. Smart Tab, you can see it's a Smart Tab system includes key features like comprehensive route management, flexible passenger payment methods, flexible route and fare product setup, shift and dispatch management, cashier system, inspection tools, and comprehensive management information systems reports. So the Smart Tab solution includes a full back-end management system, as well as an on-bus electronic ticketing machine. Thank you very much, Smart Tab. JC Auditors, maybe Oliver want to say a few words.
Yes, Harry, I will give you a break. Thanks again. And also well done to Liesl and the Unitrans team on talking about sustainability again, which is becoming an increasingly important area for, I think, everybody in the world. And we're also very proud, Liesl, of our association with Unitrans. JC Auditors supplies ISO 9000, 14000, 45000, and RTMS to the Unitrans group, and we really appreciate our association there. So essentially, we look forward to working with other organizations who value or commit to rather corporate governance and who value being at the forefront of service delivery, environmental compliance, and taking care of its employees as well. We've got our head offices in KZN. We operate in all 9 provinces, and we're very privileged also to work with all the leading transport companies, and very also happy with our association with the Transport Forum as well. And we welcome any inquiries you may have on any certifications, and our team will be happy to assist. Thanks, Harry, and Liesl, all the best for the remainder of the session. Looking forward to it.
Thank you, Oliver. Great being associated with JC Orders as well. Thank you for your gold sponsorship. We really appreciate it. Bisco, developing skills for the supply chain. Someone from Bisco want to say a few words? They practice effective logistics. Aline, you want to say a few words?
Yes, it's a beautiful. Our focus is on developing skills in supply chain through skills development and training. And for further information, we can contact on inquiries with courtesy of the. Thank you.
Thank you, Aline. Your sound wasn't too big, but I think we could make out what you were saying. So thank you for your support. Great value-added processes for your company while improving competitiveness with internationally accredited courses. Thank you, Bisco. Really appreciate your support. Zutari, how about somebody from Zutari talking to us this morning? They say Impact Engineer, previously known as Oricon. Ladies and gents, consulting engineering group. You really should talk to them should you be in need of consulting services, and in terms of civil engineering and so forth, consulting engineers of note. Thank you very much, Zutari. They've actually been a gold sponsor of the Transport Forum for many years. Thank you for your support. Standard Bank, over 159 years of experience. So they believe that the dreams matter and that together we can make them a reality. Operates in more than 20 countries in Africa and abroad. The worldwide presence consists of an integrated suite of end-to-end wealth management services and banking solutions. Standard Bank also being a gold sponsor. And Kathy Bell from Standard Bank also involved with the RTMS, been supporting myself as well and mentoring quite a lot. So thank you very much, Standard Bank. Cuba. Somebody from Cuba. They say they're transforming ticketing. Cuba is part of the IC Mobility Group, enables public and private transport to move into the digital area with journey planning, smart ticketing, streamlining electronic payment, shaping the digital transformation of the mobility sector. Thank you, Cuba, also a gold sponsor for many years with the Transport Forum. Easy Clear, somebody from Easy Clear. It's a leading software provider for the customs and clearing industry. So the software solutions for customs clearing, freight forwarding, and logistics providers, covering air, sea, road, and rail. Thank you, Easy Clear. Here we've got the Bunya Capital. It's one of our BE initiatives in the Transport Forum, supporting them. So public transport knowledge hub for bespoke taxi industry sites, integrated public transport network advisory and public transport thought leadership. You can obviously pick up all the links on the Transport Forum website to access these companies. And you can talk to Lucilia Majola, who's the CEO of the Bunya Group, should you need more information in the taxi industry. So now about some fun. Hopefully you guys listen carefully. And we're going to do the competition now. So two of you, and ladies and gents, unfortunately, it's only for locals. We can't do it for international people. So what we're going to do now is we're going to ask two questions. And for each question, somebody can win these two prizes if you answer the question correctly. So the first person answering the question correctly, that person is the winner then, and we will we'll have your prize couriered to you. So obviously after the event, we'll contact you for your preferred delivery address and so on. And just seeing a lot of people are still coming into the session as well. But okay, so you can use the chat room now. At the bottom of your screen, you should see there's a chat room, all right? And the chat room, we're going to keep an eye on to see who's answering the question answer, who answered the question right first. All right, and then I will announce who's the winner. So here's the first question. Today's event, who's our hosting company today? There we go, Berlin. That was fast. Okay, Berlin won that one. Berlin. We were very fast. All right, then here comes question 2. Who is providing an online booking tool for all your corporate travel needs? There, ticket for Gordon Lane. Gordon? Congratulations, Gordon. You were sharp and fast on that one. All right, so congratulations to our winners. We will make sure that your prizes will reach you soonest. So they are our sponsors of this event and alliances and media partners. So let's give them a big hand, ladies and gentlemen, for making this Transport Forum possible. I would really appreciate their kind support. All right. I just want to refresh your minds. The Transport Forum's business directory This is actually very popular, ladies and gents. It's a well-categorized business directory we're building up. And that's only to have your company listed here. It's only 450 rands per year. That's not really money. And we've outsourced this also as a BE initiative to Olga Mashilo, Berlin Bondley consultant. There's a number on the screen. You can take a picture of this, and you can then phone Olga, and she will help you to get your company listed. We've been told that people are getting lots of leads on this. You can actually see on the website as well the number of leads for these companies being listed in the business directory. So you can contact Olga. Also, after this event, you will receive an email requesting your feedback about this event, and also we will remind you in that ask you whether you want Olga to contact you. So we do that as well. So we ask you after the event, should we ask your feedback on this event, please give us the feedback, because we use that information to plan for future sessions and so on. It's very important that you please give us some feedback. All right. So yeah, the Transport Forum, the presentations you see presented here, and actually all the presentations presented over the past 15 years are available complimentary from the Transport Forum website. It's a very powerful knowledge base. I've been told it's one of the most powerful in Africa, and because there's more than 900 presentations being presented over 15 years, and you can go and search it, and it's a simple little search engine that's making it possible for you to access the presentations for free. And so if you go to the Transport Forum website, to the left of the screen, you will see there's a user login. So you use your username and password and you log in. You have to log in, otherwise you won't be able to see the presentations. Should you not have an account with the Transport Forum yet, you can create your own complimentary account by clicking on sign up, and then it'll take you through a simple little registration process to register yourself, create your own username and password, and there you go. You can access the presentations. How do you access them? Transport Forum website. You go to events, you go to downloads. You click on downloads, you will see there's a little search engine. So you can either type in the title or the description. So, for example, you can type in a person's name or surname. When you hit search, it will search through 15 years of presentations and give you all the presentations presented by that person. Or you can type in a description like logistics or renewables or whatever. Hit search and will search for all the presentations of that topic included in the title. Or you can go to category and you select the date of the event, like today's date, hit search, and that will give you the presentation. So as simple as that, but very powerful. All right, so there we are, and there's our program for the day. Sustainability and Transport, 25th of August 2022. And I'm now gladly going to hand you over to our host and our MC today, Liesel de Wet. Thank you, Liesel. We really appreciate what you do.
Thanks, Harry. Thank you so much. And I'm really excited to be emceeing this event today. And we've got a phenomenal lineup of speakers. So I'm going to quickly just share my screen and just take you through a quick presentation. Right, can you see my screen, Harry?
Perfect.
Okay, so a little bit about Unitrans, who we are, and my favorite go-to is always about why we are here, what our purpose is. Our purpose as a trusted service partner is to extend our range of services with existing and future customers to provide them with the space to focus on growing their core businesses. And obviously to do this, it's underpinned by making sure that we're safe, we're innovative, that we partner with our clients, and we unlock value for all stakeholders. So if you have a look, just a high-level overview, we operate about 81 depots. We have about a fleet of 2,000 vehicles, 5,000 employees, and we operate with general freight and warehousing, specialized freight and warehousing, and food and consumer logistics. We also do cross-border distribution. So obviously, this has been quite an interesting time for all of us. I think COVID has highlighted a whole bunch of things, and now I was chatting to a colleague the other day, and it seems like it's in the past. But what it did do was highlight quite a few elements, like the role of technology and digitization in our industry. Working conditions, that now we can work from home. There's part-time working, flexible hours that never used to exist prior. And I think one of the biggest things that it did highlight was the impact on the environment. I'm sure many of you saw a lot of memes that were going around the internet about wildlife returning. And what it really did do was highlight our impact. And so it gave sustainability a seat at the boardroom table, and it definitely prompted governments and industry alike to look at this and say, we have a responsibility here, and we have to look at how do we build back better. So on top of our macroeconomic challenges, obviously the climate situation is definitely not improving. In fact, the latest IPCC report is actually showing that we are looking at exceeding the 1.5 trajectory by quite a lot. In fact, the other day I read an article that there's quotes around about a 3 or 4 degree warming if we don't start doing drastic measures. And I think another thing the report highlighted is that human influence is definitely contributing at quite a rapid rate to the natural warming of the planet, and that we need to do something. In some industries, such as ours, it's very difficult to initially look and see, well, what is it? What can we do? How do we improve our footprint? And I'm really excited to have Ruta Messi on going to do a presentation, because the MBI have done some phenomenal work on scenarios for the transport industry. So, we all do the best practice, and we all make sure that we run as fuel efficient as possible. But we need that step change to get us to these kind of deep level abatement reductions that are required for us to reach these targets. And how does that look? And it really does provide some guidance on that, which is really great. So clients are definitely starting to look now at their supply chain partners to achieve their sustainability goals. And being in the industry for as long as I have been, I've really seen this uptick in this trend phenomenally in the last at least 2-3 years. And I think it's also linked to the experience of during COVID, that transport is a material impact in any supply chain, and customers are demanding visibility from their partners in terms of their supply chain emissions. It's no longer good enough to just look at your scope 1 and 2. You really start to need to look at your extended producer responsibility, and you need to see the whole entire life cycle of your product. So where are we at Unitrans? We recognize that it's imperative to develop and implement a sustainable business, and linked to our environmental, social, and governance. So how profits are obtained, the financial robustness of the organization is exceptionally important, but also sustainable profits to add the value, and also that we part in creation of a just society. We don't live in a vacuum, we live in a society, and it's really, really important that this purpose is made personal. Climate change is there, resource intensity and scarcity is definitely there. We have these other elements like international conflict, which is definitely playing havoc with the oil price. And, looking at how do we work around this and how we build value-aligned ecosystems is exceptionally important. So, in essence, long-term sustainable value creation definitely starts with clarity of purpose in this space. So just a quick little touch on what accelerated organizational sustainability is, what we do in the business. So we are here to drive sustainability efforts, both internally and externally, aligned to our purpose, to also positively contribute to the financial success of the organization and reduce our impact on the planet and the communities within which we operate. So it's really, really important that we make sure that we reduce our impact as much as possible, increase our operational efficiencies, and also then unlock new business opportunities, which is really exciting in this space. Sustainability does provide an avenue to unlock new business opportunities because it requires creative thought and innovation. and definitely increase our brand reputation and market positioning, and to attract new talent. I think the new market force that is coming into our market is very, very specific around these types of topics. And if you start looking at the influencers like Greta Thunberg, for example, it's really, really important to them. And as such, we need to be in a position to attract top talent. So just a quick around our sustainability journey to date. So our main focus was always to get the fundamentals right. So making sure that the data is correct, where the data comes from, does it represent what it's supposed to, how's the reporting process flow, and also understanding the business dynamics. Then we started looking at our consumption profile once we made sure we got the data correct. And also something that's really important and linked to the culture of our organization is what is the overall vibe indicator around sustainability? And I'm very happy to say that it's good vibes only. Most people want to do the right thing. They want to contribute to the greater good. And I think a lot of the challenges really is, okay, I understand this personally, but how do I do this in my professional role? What is it that we need to do? And to provide guidance on that and assistance there. We'll be launching an internal sustainability program in due course. We are aligned to the Sustainable Development Goals, and as such, our entire strategic leadership team have signed a pledge around our commitments in terms of where we're going and what we aim to achieve, and that we'll be launching that shortly. So if you look about sort of the grassroots of sustainability in action, these are just some of the things that we have in place in our business. And yes, driver training is exceptionally important. I've always say that you can put any driver in the most fuel green vehicle that you can find, but if he doesn't drive it correctly, you're never going to get the savings you require. So driver training is exceptionally important for us in our business, not only from a fuel efficiency perspective, but most importantly from a safety perspective and the role that we play within the communities that we operate. We have a dedicated technical department who continuously test new technologies and equipments to see what works and what doesn't work. We had a project which reduced idling time, which resulted in a 6.6 improvement. And we also now have dedicated focus around sustainability within our business. Robust stakeholder engagement is also very critical, aligned to awareness creation within the industry. As Oliver said earlier, we have quite a few of standards in place from the ISOs. We've also recently signed up to Operation Clean Sweep. So that's a really great program, and it's linked to us transporting plastic and doing it correctly. And Safripol, who's also our sister company, has the entire supply chain now signed up to Operational Clean Sweep. We are the first transporters to sign up to this, and we're really excited and proud of that. Industry participation is also exceptionally important, and I need to just highlight the Road Freight Association, and this is also part of this process has given us engagement with the MBI. So the RFA is an association of which we are a member. They support the greenhouse gas reduction and mitigating climate change actively amongst their members, and also involved in strategic discussions with all the relevant stakeholders, such as oil companies, vehicle manufacturers, and operators, to look at viable options and green solutions for the industry. And part of one of the working groups for the Road Freight Association is the Green Transport Working Group. And I would really encourage you, if you haven't been part of this and you are interested in this topic, in this area, to please join us. We have at least 4 meetings a year, 4 to 2, depending. We had a meeting already this year and some presentations at the annual RFA conference. But the objective of the working group is to have that conversation, to discuss and understand what alternatives are there, what opportunities are there in the transport industry. We've had some finance institutions come speak to us about how would you finance the refleeting in green transport. So that's really been great. And then also to be in a position where we know what the core issues are, that we can lobby the correct stakeholders and have engagement with them moving forward. So that is Unitrans and our role here in a nutshell. And we're really excited to be part of the Transport Forum. And I'd really like to kick off and introduce our first speaker, Rutumeti Molatane. Ritumesi is from the National Business Initiative. She heads up the environmental division there, and she led the analysis and reporting of national mitigation activities to various audiences, including the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. She provided strategic and advisory services in the development and implementation of South Africa's climate change flagship program, attracting investment and enhancing implementing capacity. Ritumesi was previously the Senior Manager Climate Change at Ernst & Young and Senior Consultant at Camco Clean Energy. Ritumesi holds an MSc from Imperial College London and an undergraduate degree from the University of Witwatersrand, Johannesburg. And I'm very pleased that she's here today to share the insights on the work that the NBI have done on green transport, on the scenarios that are available to the industry. It was a multi-stakeholder event, and we were part of quite a few of those discussions. So over to you, Ritumesi. We look forward to your presentation.
Thank you very much, Liesl, and thank you very much for this opportunity to share a little bit of the work that we've been doing in the transport sector. So I'm very pleased to be able to just give you some insight into work that we hope to be publishing in the next few weeks or so. I have a presentation. It is quite a long presentation, but perhaps to just defer to the chair, I'm happy to take questions or make sure that the session is interactive. If people have got any questions to ask, I'm quite happy to take the questions at your direction.
Sure, no problem.
Okay, so I hope you can all see the presentation clearly.
Yes.
And thanks very much, Liesl. I thought I should just give a quick introduction into who the NBI is. So we are an independent business organization, a voluntary business organization, and there's text that speaks to who we are. But I think in a nutshell, the NBI was formed shortly after South Africa transitioned to a democratic country in order to position business as a force for good. So as a proactive kind of builder and leader in shaping the new South Africa. And that's really what the NBI speaks to and what we try to achieve. And we work in a number of different areas. Environment is one of those, but we also work on issues around social transformation. It involves gender, youth, employability, skills, and bringing in sort of economic inclusion issues. So a whole range of areas that I think our country needs to be able to address. And then we work on building technical capacity, particularly in government. So local government is one of our big focus areas, but we also work with other spheres of government to, I think, really contribute to building that developmental state. We need all of these actors playing a very productive role in order for the country to really get on its feet and to achieve its potential. So that's really what the NBI speaks to. I'm going to jump straight ahead into the work that we've been doing on the Just Transition Pathways, and just to indicate some of the key drivers for this work. I think the one, before I even get into the trade risks, just to speak to the fact that South Africa is highly vulnerable to climate change. So this region, the Southern African region, is a global warming hotspot. So we're typically warming at twice the global average. And I think we've been freshly reminded of some of those impacts that can be associated with climate. We had the Cyclone Idai a couple of years ago, which was a catastrophic event, and more recently, some of the flooding that we've seen in KZN. But that's also been coupled with years of quite intense droughts in other parts of the country. So there's a definite physical component to the impacts from climate change. But in addition to that, and I think we're appreciating this more and more as a country, there are also significant trade risks. So I've highlighted here the number of countries that have already committed to a net zero emissions economy by 2050. And you can see the bulk there. So some of our key trade partners, and I'll show those in another slide just after this, but that even some of these countries have also committed to net zero before 2050. So that's quite ambitious. And even in the developing country blocks, you've got countries who've also committed to net zero, maybe not by 2050. I think the Chinese goal is by 2060. With South Africa, we've not committed to net zero by 2050, but our NDC, the lower bound, is in the range of net zero by 2050. So while we've not explicitly said that we've made this commitment, it is implied in the commitment that we submitted to the UN last year in terms of what our country could contribute to global efforts to combat climate change. So I was speaking to the trade risk and the vulnerability, but to show it in another way, that in terms of our major trade partners, and I think the EU is one of those major trade partners, but you've got others as well. You've already seen the progress towards implementing carbon border tax adjustments, which really penalize countries that still have carbon-intensive commodities that are entering that particular space. And this is linked to the commitments that those countries have made to reduce their emissions, and now extending, I think, that policy, slightly beyond their borders in a way. But you can see that those countries, most of our trade partners, just if you look at our trade balance, have already done that. And I think the carbon border tax adjustment conversation is a big one. That's on the minds of quite a lot of the companies that we work with as well. I think another way of looking at this is just to get a sense of, in terms of our key commodities and trade balance, how at risk are we as a country based on who we're trading with and what commitments they've made. And you can see that most of the commodities that make up our trade, our key trade, are actually sitting in this super vulnerable space, either because they're directly associated with fossil fuels or rely on fossil fuel power in order to, actually for them to be produced. Some of the commodities, I think, to highlight, for example, the motor vehicles and parts, with the change in the commitments that some of these countries have made, some of them are looking to ban internal combustion engines by, I think, as early as 2035. So that has implications as well for our trade balance from that perspective. But I think it's just to speak to the point that as a country, we are vulnerable both from a physical perspective, but also from trade-related impacts of climate change and how other countries are basing their trading behavior on their own commitments and how their counterparts actually are responding to those. And South Africa then in this case becomes a taker of global change. So we don't drive global change, but I think it's important for us as a country to be able to manage, to understand and recognize that these things are happening, and then to be able to manage so that we can take advantage of emerging opportunities, but are also able to mitigate some of those big impacts. Perhaps reflecting a little bit on what Liesl was mentioning around what Unitrans is doing, and maybe just indicating from our perspective, some of the work that we do more broadly, and how we encourage companies to increase their climate ambition, as well as to be able to demonstrate what they're doing against those commitments. We have a few pillars that we look at. So very much around making sure that companies are able to publicly commit to making those ambitious goals, and are able to demonstrate publicly what they're doing in the space. And we have some initiatives that speak to that. We very much support setting of science-based targets, and having very clear goals and a pathway towards how those targets can be achieved, being able to report transparently on what activities a company is undertaking, and really to demonstrate that climate change is something that is considered at the highest strategic levels. So something like the task force for climate climate-related financial disclosures, is something that's really key. That starts to demonstrate that a company recognizes that climate change is a material risk to the company, and therefore needs to be treated that way. And then I'm going to speak a little bit about this specific piece of work around the Just Transition Pathways project, but this is really around then being able to contribute, I think, more broadly to the national dialogue of what the just transition looks like, and be able to cascade that to a sectoral view of what needs to take place over the next 30 years or so for our economy to be able to transition, and doing this by going from sector to sector. And then what we also do is we really do try to profile and to promote what South Africa as a whole is doing. We host the South Africa Pavilion at the various COPs. So we'll be hosting another pavilion at the COP in Sharm el-Sheikh later on this year, really about elevating the South African messaging on what we're doing. And we hope that this is then a basis for attracting the level of investment that we want in our transition. And in fact, at the moment, South Africa is busy developing an investment plan in response to the $8.5 billion that was pledged to help South Africa to transition its economy. And so these are the sorts of opportunities that we really do look for, realizing that climate change requires a whole range of actors to be able to respond, and that the international community, in addition to what's happening nationally, needs to come in to be able to support the transition. So this is just a big an overview of, I think, the journey that we travel with companies, just selecting specific pillars that speak to these various principles. I'll focus on the Just Transition Pathways work itself, which really tries to understand where the opportunities lie for South Africa to transition its economy to net zero by 2050, and looking at the different sectors. And I'm obviously going to be focusing a little bit on transport today. But just to give you a sense of how we've structured this work around the Just Transition, I'm aiming to answer a few questions, but the one that I will emphasize is really, in the end, how do you structure your economy and the set of activities that you need to be taking over the next few years, as well as the various policy levers and other sorts of levers that you need to put in place in order to achieve this transition. What does that look like? And that's really the heart of this work. And hopefully that becomes a basis then that companies, organizations, that the country can use to inform various planning initiatives. And the work has relied on support from a range of CEO champions that I will show just in the next slides. And this is speaking to this idea of business having quite a high level profile and being actively engaged in helping to shape, I think, the country that we want to see, one that's economically competitive, but one that is also just and inclusive. And in order to get to this view that we are still building and kind of getting close to finishing off, we've been working on this over the past 2 or so years. We've engaged with a whole range of stakeholders, so from business, government, civil society, and labor, to try and come up with what these transition pathways could look like and how they can be put together at an economic level to really transform the South African economy. Just a sense of who our Just Transition CEO champions are. I think what's notable is that these are CEOs that are from sectors that are very exposed to climate risk, particularly from a transition perspective, but also sectors that shore up the South African economy. And I think also notable is that there's a diverse range of actors that have come to publicly support this work and just really give the level of gravitas that's needed for an undertaking of this size. So the work, overall, has covered 95% of South Africa's national emissions. So that's quite a big chunk of what we need to address. And in terms of the sectors that we've looked at everything from the power sector, petrochemicals and chemicals. We've looked at buildings and construction, as well as manufacturing. We've looked at the mining sector. Transport is one that we are just wrapping up at the moment. And we've looked at agriculture and forestry. The one sector that we didn't look at in a lot of detail was waste. And that's why we haven't reached that 100%. But we think we've been able to address a fair chunk of what South Africa needs to do. And as we've developed these reports, as we've completed the work, we have put that in the form of a report that people are able to access. So it's on the NBI website, and you're all encouraged to take a look at some of the findings. We're now working to finish the last set of reports, literally are kind of reviewing and putting this together, which we hope to be publishing over the next few months or so. We anticipate launching the full integrated report that consolidates all of the findings across the sectors. That will be done at COP, but we will be sharing this, and it's very much in line with what we wanted to do of stimulating conversation, preparing a fact base that is available for people to then take this work further in their own organizations or their own specific jurisdiction. And then I thought, before I get to the technical part, just to also mention that in addition to the very specific techno-economic pathways that we've identified, which you see here as the pillars of this building, we've been very much focused as well on, appreciating and making sure that how those transitions take place is in a just manner. So we've got this vision of a transition that is obviously environmentally sustainable, but it is inclusive, and acknowledging that it needs to be managed in order to be really effective and to avoid some of those impacts that we can anticipate, and that we really want to contribute to these goals of decent work, social inclusion, and fighting some of the big ills that South Africa battles with. So it's part of the Just Transition work, looking at the specific sectors. We have an additional component that really looks at the key building blocks that you need for a just transition. So there are areas around job creation, understanding that changes in what we produce as a country have implications on your workforce and communities. How do we make sure that this just transition is indeed just, by making sure that we can include all I think South Africans in the economy, and that there are opportunities to really participate. And there are a whole range of other issues that are embedded in this thinking around the just transition. So while I'm not focusing on this element, I just thought it would be important to highlight that in addition to the techno-economic pathways themselves, this is an ongoing area of work that we are working with and kind of grappling with, and to understand how do businesses translate all of this and take it forward in their operations, and how they deal with their communities in their value chains, and how all of this rolls up into what we hope to see as a just transition in the country. So moving away from the overall study and focusing specifically on what we've been doing in the transport sector, and this gives you a sense of the approach that we've taken. So we based very much what we've been doing on understanding what national emissions are, and that's based on the National Greenhouse Gas Inventory. And then we've looked at a whole range of things, what's happening globally, but how does that translate into the South African space? What are the pathways that we see for South Africa's transport sector in particular? And then some of those other things that I was mentioning around the just transition component. And then finally, what do we need to do in the immediate future? So in terms of where transport is sitting, transport is a big chunk of South Africa's national emissions. So you get a sense of where these emissions are sitting relative to the other sectors. But I do think, if I recall in my days at the Department of Forestry, Fisheries and Environment, the transport is one of the fastest growing categories of emissions relative to the others. So it is a key category in our emissions inventory, and one that is an important one to consider. So most of the emissions that we're seeing from the transport sector are sitting in the road, in road transport bit, and you can see the breakdown there. So quite a fair chunk from passenger vehicles, but there is also a significant contribution from maybe your heavy your freight sector through your commercial vehicles, as well as the heavy duty ones as well. We didn't really look at shipping as part of the study, but we did look at some of the opportunities that are sitting in perhaps the hydrogen economy, and they have definite applications in the shipping sector as well. So in terms of some of the issues, I don't think I need to speak to you about some of the issues in the transport sector, but some of the things that have been highlighted and have informed how we approach the work was an appreciation that transport is quite costly in South Africa, that in many cases we're struggling with infrastructure and getting it where we want it to be, to have an efficient transport system, both for your passengers, but also for the freight and the economic activity of this country. And that in many cases that there are issues around the safety and security of these systems. I think maybe also just to mention that in addition to focusing on the transport sector, the work that we did recognized that transport sits within a whole range of, or at least it sits within a value chain and is an important part of what happens in other sectors, from manufacturing sector, for example. It plays a role in I think, in mining sector, but it impacts what our power sector could look like depending on those trends. And so this is one of the other things that we also considered and looked at it in a bit more detail, specifically in the integrated report, as well as drawing on specific aspects in the sectoral reports that we've also published. I just wanted to give you that sense. In terms of how we've positioned what the transport sector needs to look like, the decarbonisation challenge is quite clear, but there are also these issues around efficiency, reliability, and affordability, and how that demand management is also implemented. And that, understanding that it is a big emissions category, it is a growing emissions category, and this is one of the key areas that we will be looking at, I think, going forward. So in terms of some of the global trends, and I won't go into this in a lot of detail, just noting the time that is available. I think one of the things to highlight was around more your green fuels. So green hydrogen is a big one that we cover quite separately, but that the other big kind of industrial trend that we're seeing in the transport sector is around electrification. I think I speak to that a little bit more, in addition to other technologies that are also emerging, but these are the big ones that we're seeing as playing a role in the South African space. And I think just globally indicating that from a vehicles perspective, electrification is anticipated to be kind of the primary mode. So by 2050, you're seeing up to 100% of electric vehicles dominating the road, with many of the countries that I've mentioned before actually banning your internal combustion engines. But you also get a sense of some of the other trends that we're seeing in the other sectors as well. And I thought that this would be useful to highlight. I think Harry at the beginning indicated that there's a huge resource of presentations that people are also able to visit after this. And I think some of these details people will also be able to look at their leisure. I think maybe also just to focus again on some of these trends. I've mentioned electrification for road vehicles, and also this kind of attention as well with fuel cells that we're seeing, particularly for your heavy commercial vehicles as well, and that there's also an impact that we anticipate as freight tends to shift from road to the rail space. But that's also dependent on, I think, the South African kind of economy being able to rely on a kind of an affordable as well as a reliable rail system. And then maybe also just to highlight again, I think again what we're seeing in terms of the maturity and the cost. I just wanted to highlight particularly around your fuel cell vehicles, where the costs are still quite high, and the level of maturity is increasing. And I know that there are certain companies that are starting to test this or working towards this, but we see this as one of the big kind of trends going forward. And there'll be an interesting tension, I think, again, as I mentioned, between your battery electric vehicles, particularly for road transport, as well as the fuel cell technologies. Although perhaps to say in South Africa, the fuel cell technology, so the hydrogen-based economy, is one that is being focused on for a range of kind of applications. And so we would anticipate that from a policy perspective, there'd probably be a lot more support for starting to see the fuel cells be more active in larger and the more heavy vehicles in the road sector. Just to give you a sense of kind of how we looked at this work. So we did look at international trends, but we also looked at kind of various base cases and scenarios that we were looking at. Some of them relying just on what would happen, if we were just informed by international trends, but also trying to look at what specific interventions we need to put in place as a country to make the transition, occur in a way that is beneficial for South Africa. And so in terms of the three key levers that we've identified to decarbonize the economy, the modal shift, I think, is one that is quite obvious. So the shift from road to rail is a big one, as well as from passenger vehicles to public transport. There's a technology shift, which I think is also quite central. So I've spoken about the electrification, whether it be through batteries or the use of fuel cells and kind of hydrogen-based approaches. And then again, the hydrogen features in the fuel greening space, particularly for aviation and for shipping. And we didn't look in a lot of detail for road, but to note that this is an opportunity that has been prioritized, I think, nationally. So this should be a very interesting space for the transport sector going forward. I think maybe not to go into this in a lot of detail, but to recognize that for each of these opportunities that we've identified, there is definitely a trade-off. So there's considerations around the OPEX and the CAPEX intensity, and you've got an indication there of where we're sitting and the infrastructure cost that's associated with shifting to those. So obviously, when it comes to expanding huge infrastructure around rail and things like that, the cost is quite high, and it decreases as you focus on things like if it's just specifically fuels, which is not, you're not necessarily looking at the huge infrastructure that's associated with that, but the intervention at the fuel point is much, much lower. But that there are a whole range of impacts. So there are impacts on transport costs that we've indicated there. There are also impacts on other industries that rely, on some of these actors in their own value chains. And I think the fossil fuel demand is obviously a huge one for South Africa, one that can be mitigated by shifting to green hydrogen, just leveraging the specific expertise we have in the space. But these are huge implications when we note, the kind of the scale and the role that some of these companies occupy within the South African economy. And we've tried to look at, more broadly speaking, so things around the tax revenue losses, but also the ability that we have as a country to address some of the current challenges that we already have. And that's really how we've looked at some of these opportunities. So I think in just getting close to just closing off in this session, that obviously to be able to mitigate emissions, we really do need to be able to combine all of these three levers. And we've just spoken to how we think we need to break this down. The electric vehicle space is a very interesting one, but one that we see will have a huge impact on what our vehicle park looks like, but also has quite big implications from a trade perspective, as we are quite active in the automobile sector. So understanding how that particular sector will be transitioning is something that is really key in our consideration. I know that the amount of time is quite limited, so I'm not going to go through all of the slides, but maybe just to reflect also on what we've seen from a costing perspective. So that's just an indication of focusing on the electric vehicle space in particular, and some of the other things that I noted, so rail expansion and maybe increasing the availability of public transportation, and we've focused on buses, just what the cost implications, initial ones that we've seen look like. And I think I spoke to this a little bit earlier on, just noting how the costs increase where the amount of infrastructure investment also goes up quite significantly. So I think just noting it is quite a long slide deck. I'm happy to, I think I've shared these with Liesl as well, and that they'll be available to the people who are participating in the forum, and also to invite you to please look out for an invitation to the launch of the transport report itself, so that you can look at some of the things that I've highlighted in a bit more detail, and also very happy to get general feedback and further engagement if the opportunity is available. Thank you very much, Liesl. I think that's my time.
Rutamesi, thank you so very much. And this work that the NBI is doing is so valuable to help us just sort of wrap our heads around what this just transition scenario could look like and what would contribute to that. We have a few questions here. One of them is from Gideon Kutsia. He says, I see electricity generation is very high and then rail very low. Is electrified rail transport extracted from that, or how do we avoid double counting emissions there? I think that might refer to one of your slides.
Okay, I think so. So we definitely did not do double counting. So what we did, if I just recall, we did go at and look at each sector and each mode of transport. And then we also looked at in the power sector report as well, which is one of the reports that we published. And what we did initially, we did try to disaggregate kind of the demand. And then as we've been kind of refining and going through each one of the sectors, we have been refining that as well. So yeah, we definitely made sure that we didn't double count, but that we did kind of look at the impacts that were happening between the different sectors. And yeah, that's one of the issues.
Henry says, I don't see the humble bicycle featured in reducing our reliance on cars for personal transport. So I think there was just a comment there around transport and bicycles, which then Gordon, you've sent quite a long question here, but I'm just going to boil it down to the last section here. Gordon asks, how do we bring in the avoid and shift aspects to front of mind? This becomes especially important given that transport contributes up to 40% of emissions in our cities.
Yeah, if I understand correctly, that's like demand management. So I hope I've understood that correctly. So we did look at, I think to
hold on, Gordon's got his hand up. He wants to explain it a bit better. Gordon, just unmute yourself.
Thanks, Liesl. Yeah, thanks very much. I think it's more importantly is not the avoidance, is the avoiding the need to travel or move goods. So it's shortening the distance that things are needed to be moved or people need to travel. And this speaks broader than the transport industry. It talks to the whole land use planning, integration of our cities, densification side of things. And then it also picks up on Henry's issue around the bicycle and walking. And I've mentioned that as well, bicycling and walking not forming the fundamental departure point for transport planning. I know we're focusing primarily on freight here, but the movement of people and goods and the high GHG emissions of transport within the urban areas is massively important. And I think we've missed a big trick in this not considering that aspect of the transport conversation.
So,
thanks, Liesl. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Gordon.
Yeah.
Ritameti, you want to comment there?
May I go ahead? Yes, I think we did actually in our technical working group, so we did discuss this at length. I think where we didn't focus on was kind of trying to quantify the densification component, but we did look at, I know in some of the sessions, if you look at how South African cities are built, the level of urban sprawl. So we did look at that in quite a lot of detail, and also had a range of kind of policy recommendations that we think need to be considered, and that speak more to the densification aspect. I think perhaps less. We definitely didn't do non-motorized transport. So that I acknowledge. Mm-hmm.
Just a comment. So the work that's coming out of the NBI on the just transition and that, will the government be engaging with that, with the work, and then start looking at policy development? How do they unlock value in terms of like electric vehicles, getting that more mainstream, and even alternative fuels, So will they be engaging with this work? Do they have a level of interest in engaging in this work? Because I think it's really valuable to sort of define the narrative around this and solutions forward.
I think so. What we did do is, as part of the governance structure of the project, we had an advisory group that had government representatives in it. We had also a separate working group specifically with government, just to kind of socialize the work and to make it available. We shared this work with the Presidential Climate Commission, and so that went into the NDC, our country commitment as well. And we are just continuing to engage with them. So trying to influence, for example, I know we had engagement specifically on the South African Renewable Energy Master Plan, but even with the DTIC on the various master plans that they've been producing, the work is available, and we've put it there, and have made ourselves available as well to kind of help, if I can put it that way.
Fantastic. That's fantastic. And really, I just want to thank you again for the work. And it's, being part of this process was also an eye opener for us in the industry. And we were extensively engaged in a lot of those workshops. So thank you so much for your time and your presentation. I know we have some other questions, but we're running a little bit over time, and we need to just give everyone a quick comfort break before we move on to the next fantastic speaker, Paul, on alternative fuels, which actually links quite nicely to your scenario planning. So I think we just having a quick comfort break. Harry, shall we stick to the time of 10:20? That everyone returns back.
Yes, we can do that. Let me see.
Okay.
20 past. Yeah, let's make it 10:25.
All right, fantastic. And please, any questions that haven't been addressed, please just email us separately, and I'll engage with Ritamensi to get an answer for you there. Thank you so very much, and we'll see you at 10:25.
Thank you, guys.
Hi, everybody. I hope you're all back and refreshed and enjoyed your comfort break and got your cup of coffee going. Looking forward to the next part of the presentation today. So as highlighted in Rutameti's presentation, one of the key areas for this industry to look at decarbonization or to reach a potential net zero by 2050 is fuel greening. And I'm very excited to have Paul here today to talk to us about alternative fuels for the transport industry. Paul is an engineer by training with degrees in mechanical engineering and energy studies from the University of Cape Town. He joined Sasol Oil Research and Development Team in 1995, initially based in Sasolburg and then relocating to Cape Town to establish the Sasol Advanced Fuels Laboratory at UCT, which focused on fundamental combustion research. This was followed by 2 stints in Germany, working on collaborative projects with Daimler Chrysler, which focused on the optimization of diesel engines for operation on fuel produced by Sasol's gas-to-liquids technologies. He's currently based at Sasol Fuels Applications Center in Cape Town, where he leads a team of engineers responsible for all applications, testing, and development of Sasol's energy products. And I've actually been privileged enough to go and tour that facility, and let me tell you, it's really, really impressive. During his career, he has been involved in a wide variety of fuels and R&D activities, including Formula One racing fuel development, combustion and emissions research with a wide range of conventional and alternative fuels, engine optimization studies, fuel additive testing and development, life cycle assessments, as well as technical market support and business development activities. He's currently very involved in Sasol's activities to bring hydrogen to the mobility market in South Africa. Welcome, Paul, and we look forward to your presentation.
Thanks very much, Liesl. Can you see my screen and hear me okay?
Yes, we can.
Fantastic, thank you. Okay, good morning, everyone, and thank you very much for the opportunity to present today. Alternative fuels, as you will have gathered from the introduction that Liesl gave, is something that's very close to my heart and something that I've spent a large part of my life being involved in. I am a technical person. And some of my presentation is going to be a little bit technical, so I hope you're able to bear with me in that. What I perhaps hope to share with you are some of the more practical aspects associated with all of these alternative fuel options that are currently being talked about for the transport sector. So perhaps as a first step, I should just define, for the purposes of this presentation, what I mean when I talk about alternative fuels. In a broad sense, that would be anything other than the dominant incumbent technology, which is liquid fuel derived from primarily crude oil, so petrol, diesel, kerosene, LPG as we know it. But of course, we're focusing on sustainability here, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about fuels which are a bit of a dead end from a sustainability perspective. Okay, this is the obligatory slide regarding forward-looking statements. And as by way of introduction, I thought I should try and paint a bit of the landscape of how the whole energy system for transport fuels fits together. This is not exhaustive, so there will be things that I've left out, but I hope you get the idea nonetheless. Clearly, we need to start with a primary energy source. You all know energy cannot be created or destroyed, so we need to start with some kind of energy. Broadly, we classify that as non-renewable or renewable. This is fairly intuitive. On the non-renewable side, we have the fossil fuel derived coal, crude oil, natural gas, as well as nuclear. And then on the renewable side, we have the biomass-derived fuels, such as vegetable oils, sugars, cellulosic materials, in other words, using all of the plant material. Things like algae would also fall under this category. And then we have the renewable energies that nature very kindly provides to us, such as solar energy from the sun, the wind, ocean currents and tides, hydropower from flowing rivers, and geothermal energy, which is not really a topic in South Africa, but in some countries such as Iceland and some of the Scandinavian countries, it's a very useful energy source. And then as a next step, we need to convert that energy into an energy carrier which we can use. The conversion processes are numerous and can get very complicated. And in many cases, you will also have a string of conversion processes, so one followed by another. Now, some of these processes, such as refining, and this, with the most obvious example there being crude oil, are, for all intents and purposes, extraction processes. So we have a barrel of crude oil, and within that very complex mix of molecules, we can take out a fraction of fuel oil, we can take out a fraction of diesel, of kerosene, of petrol, and then a like fraction such as LPG and maybe some gas. Now that kind of process is not very energy intensive. Some of those intermediate products that you've extracted will require upgrading, which gets a little bit more complicated, but for all intents and purposes, this is not a very, it's quite an efficient process. It's not very energy intensive, and it's relatively simple and can be done on a large scale. And this is why this is the incumbent technology at the moment. It's relatively cheap. I know with the spate of high crude oil prices that we've just gone through, and some of the episodes we've had in the past, that's might be a contentious statement, but compared to some of the alternative technologies, it is a cost-effective solution, and it provides us with products that we can readily use in the transport sector. Then there are other processes which transform the primary energy carrier into something else. Reforming, for example, takes natural gas and then converts it into synthesis gas, which is a mixture of carbon monoxide and hydrogen. And that's how the majority of hydrogen that's used today is produced, by reforming of natural gas. Gasification is when you take a solid such as coal or biomass and you process it thermally also to produce a syngas. That's the type of technology that Sasol uses on a large scale at our production plant in Secunda, where we use coal as the feedstock. You can also burn things, put it through a combustion process to generate electricity. Things like sugars, you can ferment to produce alcohols, and that's where well-known biofuels such as ethanol come from. if you've converted your primary energy source into electricity, you can then use that electricity to produce hydrogen by the electrolysis of water. So this is an example where you have a chain of different conversion processes. And synthesis is an interesting one. When we've produced synthesis gas by either reforming or gasification, we can then take those molecules, hydrogen and carbon monoxide, and build up complex hydrocarbon molecules from those in the synthesis process. And we can produce a full slate of products such as petrol, diesel, kerosene, a wide range, even alcohols and chemicals using this type of technology. And this is what essentially is what Sasol is doing. Now, the important point about these processes which transform rather than extract is that they are much more energy intensive. As soon as you start breaking chemical bonds, you need energy. It's an important differentiator from a simple extractive type of process. And many of the alternative fuel technologies rely on these type of processes. So then the process efficiency and where the energy is coming from to do this transformation process start becoming very important factors. Other important factors relating to the conversion process are what kind of byproducts are you producing? It doesn't help to produce a lot of unwanted byproducts, which have either no market value or are destructive to the environment. So there are many considerations that need to be taken into account in terms of the conversion process. What comes out of that process is what I've called the energy carrier, and this for our purposes can be in two forms. The one is chemical and the other one is electrical. So we're either producing chemical energy, energy that is contained in chemical bonds in molecules, or electrical energy, electrons essentially. And I think you'll recognize most of the examples of the chemical energy carriers that I've listed over there, the conventional fuels, the alcohols such as ethanol and methanol, also biodiesel, which typically refers to what we call FAME, fatty acid methyl esters, and HVO stands for hydrotreated vegetable oils. So this is a technology where you take a vegetable oil and then you treat it using hydrogen. So you get you essentially turn the vegetable oil into a hydrocarbon molecule, which is a very high quality diesel fuel. And then we also have the gaseous fuels such as natural gas, biogas, which is produced essentially by a fermentation process. Hydrogen, a very topical one at the moment, which you would have heard mentioned quite a lot in the previous presentation. And then also one which often doesn't immediately come to mind, which is ammonia. So ammonia has the chemical formula NH3. It comprises nitrogen and hydrogen. It's a very efficient hydrogen carrier in essence, because a liter of ammonia contains more hydrogen than a liter of liquid hydrogen because of its chemical structure. So it's actually a very nice way of carrying hydrogen. And it also has an important property in that it doesn't contain any carbon. So there's no chance of any CO2 emissions arising out of using ammonia as a fuel. It's something, and I have a slide on marine fuels, which is under consideration there, and I'll expand a little bit more when I get to that point of the presentation. Okay, and then we also have the electrical energy carrier, and this is typically by means of a battery. I don't think any further explanation is required there, or catenary wire. So this is the kind of overhead cables that you used to see with the trams that used to run around in Johannesburg, that are used extensively for electrically driven trains. And this is technology that's also being investigated in Europe at the moment for what they call electrical highways. So in fact, powering a truck by means of these catenary wires, which are overhead. Of course, it has a big implication in terms of capital expenditure. You have to essentially electrify a highway, and then what happens as soon as the truck needs to leave that highway and so on. So there are some issues associated with it, but it's interesting enough to warrant quite a few projects happening in Europe and Scandinavia, particularly, where they are investigating that technology. Right. Then the last step of the process is that we need a prime mover, which essentially converts that the energy in that energy carrier into some kind of motive force. The good old combustion engine is probably the most well-known example. And then, of course, we have the electric motor if we're dealing with electricity, and for something like hydrogen or even methanol, converting that chemical energy into electrical energy can be done by means of a fuel cell, which then drives an electric motor. The sun, wind, ocean, hydro, geothermal, those types of energies are this is really where the world is looking to capitalize on, to help decarbonize not only transportation, but all the sectors that currently rely on fossil fuels as their energy source. You produce renewable electricity from these primary energy sources, and then that renewable electricity can be either used directly in an electric vehicle, or to power all of the things that we currently use electricity to power. But it can also be used to produce what we call e-fuels, and you will have seen some references to that in the previous presentation. These are also called power to liquid fuels. In some cases where it's a liquid fuel that's under consideration, and it refers to the fact that the primary energy input is renewable electricity, and then we use that on the one hand to produce hydrogen via electrolysis, and then so then we get green hydrogen. But we can also add a sustainable carbon source to the process, and we can make hydrocarbon fuels such as petrol, diesel, kerosene, all the fuels we know and love today. We can actually produce that from renewable electricity, using renewable electricity, and depending on where the carbon source comes from, you may want to use biomass to do that. but using those ingredients, you can make these so-called e-fuels or power-to-liquid fuels. And the type of processes that you use there are electrolysis and synthesis. In many cases, these are, in essence, synthetic fuels. So we can produce methane and methanol and ammonia by these processes as well. An important thing to bear in mind there is that you need a carbon source if the fuel is going to contain carbon. So everything other than ammonia and green hydrogen contains carbon, and then the question becomes where does this carbon come from? As I said, it could be biomass, but one of the technologies that's being investigated there is direct air capture. So taking the CO2 out of the air, or you could also draw the CO2 from some kind of an industrial process, although the sustainability equation might not work out in your favor in that case. Across all of these, across this whole picture, there are all these criteria which need to be taken into account. Raw materials requirements, environmental impact, waste generation, life cycle emissions, societal impact, efficiency, practicality and utility, security of supply, safety, and of course cost. Cost is ultimately, like it or not, going to be one of the determining factors. I want to highlight raw materials requirements a bit. There was an interesting article that I just saw where someone has done the calculation to see what the raw materials requirements would be if one were to fulfill the European policymakers' ambitions of moving away from fossil-derived fuels altogether. So now we're talking about things like copper for all of the electrical equipment and conductors, lithium and cobalt and manganese for batteries. And it turns out that that sum just really doesn't look very good. In many cases, for example, copper and lithium and some others, the current production rates aren't anywhere near sufficient to actually support that kind of large-scale move away from fossil-derived fuels. And even in terms of known reserves, it's just simply not enough. So it's very easy to talk about moving away from fossil-derived fuels, and it is, of course, the right thing to do and a noble ambition. But there are some practical aspects to this which are going to be really challenging, and I think are going to stretch our ingenuity to the limits over the next few decades. Okay, my next slide is an example of how various e-fuels value chains might look, and this is specifically for zero carbon long haul trucks. And I'm showing this just to highlight some of the things that we need to take into consideration. Our inputs are sun, wind, and hydropower. We make electricity that can either be transmitted over the grid, stored in batteries, and then used in electric motors. And we are able to generate motive power with quite a high efficiency. As I was trying to explain earlier, as soon as we go through a transformation process to produce hydrogen, methane, or so-called e-diesel, we take quite a big hit in efficiency. And then we also potentially have some challenges in terms of how we transport and distribute and store some of these fuels. So hydrogen, for example, either needs to be stored as a compressed gas, which means high pressure, or as a liquid, which means very low temperature. Similarly with methane, whereas a liquid fuel such as diesel is much easier to handle and has a much higher energy density than these other alternatives, including the battery. So these are all the kind of things which determine whether one type of fuel is going to be better suited to a specific application or not. The other thing that I want to highlight here is that with things like hydrogen and the hydrocarbon fuels, the prime mover technology is a lot less efficient than the electric motor. So fuel cells and IC engines, as we know, are not as efficient, and we take quite a big hit in terms of efficiency over there. However, it may be that these are the only types of fuels which actually work in specific applications. And I'm thinking now specifically about a long-haul truck where the size and weight of the battery that you would need to cover the kind of distances that we are used to today is simply too big to be practical. So ultimately, utility and practicality are important factors, and these translate into the total cost of ownership for a particular system. And this, rather than efficiency, will determine which technology is actually the best suited for a particular application. So again, there's a level of practicality and complexity there, which is not always immediately obvious when we try and distinguish between these fuels. The slide is on marine fuels, and here there are two types of fuels which have really come to the fore as the likely candidates. These are methanol and ammonia, which we can produce from via the processes that I showed earlier. And what works in their favor is that they're widely traded commodities at the moment. So they're well-known entities in terms of bulk handling and transport. But if we look at some of the numbers on the table, all of these alternative fuels have a disadvantage when compared to MGO, marine gas oil, which is the incumbent technology, in terms of the energy density, and that relates to the fuel tank size. So in all cases, we'll need bigger fuel tanks or have to put up with a reduction in range. And that number, that multiplier, varies between the different fuels. And you can see that the worst one there is hydrogen, which is probably why liquid hydrogen is not ever going to be a good fuel for marine applications. The choice between ammonia and methanol is going to be interesting. Methanol is a nearer term technology, and some of the big shipping companies such as Maersk are currently building ships which run on methanol. However, some of the data indicates that ultimately ammonia could result in a lower total cost of ownership and might be the preferred technology. In both cases, these are toxic substances, so handling and so on is very important, particularly with ammonia, which you can store as a liquid, but under atmospheric normal pressure and temperature, it's a gas. So it will has potential to do a lot of damage to the environment. What are the options for road transport? So I've listed natural gas or biogas, battery electric, hydrogen, biofuels, and e-diesel. Natural gas comes in different forms, so either compressed or liquid. If you want a decent range, you really don't have much of a choice other than to liquefy it. But then you dealing with cryogenic liquid handling at minus 160 degrees C. So it becomes a little bit more difficult, but the vehicle and engine technology has been developed and is already being deployed out on the road. However, if we're using fossil natural gas, you do get a CO2 reduction, but it's quite modest. And for a really significant CO2 reduction, you have to go with biogas, and then production capacity, distribution, and so on might become challenging. Battery electric, as was pointed out in the previous presentation, it's very well suited to decarbonizing light-duty vehicles. If we think about our personal vehicles, particularly if we have the option of charging the batteries at home, that's great because it takes a big part of the infrastructure burden away. Trucks also entering the market. At the moment, they still have limited range, but it's a great option for inner city use and regional distribution. And if you think about things like noise, if you have a truck which is significantly more silent, it can also be used at night for deliveries and so on. So there are a lot of adjacent benefits to this type of technology, which will be really useful to capitalize on. However, the big batteries and the long charging times for big batteries mean that high load and long distance applications are very challenging for this type of vehicle. And then also, if this is rolled out on a large scale, the charging systems and the power that they require might really be limited by the electrical distribution infrastructure. So we're talking about tens, if not hundreds of megawatts if we're going to roll this out on a large scale at a single site. And the question needs to be asked whether that's actually efficient or cost effective. However, it is the highest energy efficiency option.
Paul,
This
just
is where
take note of time. Paul, just take note
Yes.
of time. Thank you.
I will speed up a bit. So this is where hydrogen comes into the picture, because it can be much more easily implemented for long distance and high load applications such as trucks, either in compressed gas or liquid form. Does have the challenge though that hydrogen is a very difficult molecule to handle. So distribution and transportation and so on is challenging. And it can also be used to partially decarbonize existing technologies in dual fuel applications. I'm not going to say very much about biofuels. They're a great option because they're liquids and have a high energy density, but the consensus is that ultimately they'll be limited by the availability of biomass. So it's probably going to be an option in the near term and might remain an option in certain applications, but ultimately it's going to be limited. And then we have e-diesel using the power to liquids technology. This is fantastic because it's much like what we have today. The problem at the moment is that the production costs are extremely high, and that might actually limit the utility of this type of fuel in the long run. So in summary, there's no silver bullet, and there are probably going to be various different fuels for lots of different applications. And then finally, a word on aviation. So this is a particularly hard to abate sector, as we know. We need energy dense fuels because of the premium on weight. Electrification and hydrogen are likely to be limited as options precisely because of the energy density issue. So ultimately, liquid hydrocarbons as we know them today are the preferred option, also because they're compatible with existing airframe and propulsion and refueling technology. And there are quite a few ways of doing that, the most promising ones are likely to be either biomass derived, what's called HEFA, hydroprocessed esters and fatty acids. That's that HVO type of fuel that I explained earlier. And then the e-fuel, making an e-kerosene from renewable electricity. And there's an interesting caveat to some of these sustainable aviation fuels. Some of them burn a lot cleaner than normal jet fuel. That results in lower soot emissions from the turbine, which results in a reduction in the formation of condensation trails or contrails. These contrails have been found to have significant impact on global warming potentially. They have a strong warming action in that they form clouds. And so this is actually a non-CO2 climate change benefit, which could result from converting to some of these SAFs. So that's all I wanted to share with you. I hope I've given you a little bit of background and detail and perhaps some information on the practical applications of alternative fuels in transportation, and I hope that was of interest.
Paul, thank you so very much. And absolutely, it's so good to understand the technicalities of the different fuels available and the applicability of them. And we've got quite a few questions, which I will take after the next presentation. So if you wouldn't mind just hanging around, if you can, and that we can address those. So thank you so much for your insights and your time today.
No
as
problem.
mentioned,
Thank you, Lisa.
Thanks, Paul. As mentioned during my presentation, obviously supply chain emissions is quite a big component of Scope 3 value chain emissions. And I'm very excited to introduce Grant Swanepoel to you today. Grant is responsible for maintaining and building relationships within the ASCM's global partners based in the Middle East and Africa. Grant has worked in the supply chain field for the past 15 years, and in this time has built his credibility in the areas of S&OP, demand planning, and supply chain improvement. This has provided him with a holistic view of supply chain management, and more importantly, an understanding of the impact that planning has on supply chain activities. Grant has also been involved with the oversight and execution of multiple supply chain projects and holds a supply chain master's degree from the University of Johannesburg. Grant's presentation today is supply chain performance management from a sustainability point of view. So welcome, Grant, and over to you.
Thank you so much, Liesl. Much appreciated. And also thank you to everybody on the call who's been hanging on for the last few hours. I really do appreciate it. Let me just share my screen because I do have a presentation for you today. Give me 1 second. Let's put that up. All right. Okay, fantastic. So let me just move that to the side and there we go. All right, so thank you so much. Really appreciate everybody's time here today. The topic that I would like to discuss with you today is actually a general supply chain topic, the topic of performance management, but also very much applies to sustainability and specifically around emissions. So I know that the majority of the people in the audience today are from the transportation industry, which emissions becomes a very important part of sustainability. I'm sure that everybody here is aware that sustainability is much more than just emissions, right? It actually covers many, many different aspects. And we will dive into this a little bit today. So I would like to share my thoughts. I'd like to share some of the insights that I have from actual projects that I've been involved with related to sustainability, and also some of the projects and products that ASCM offers to support people in this journey. So what we'll be covering today is really firstly just looking at the attributes related to environmental performance. So how do we measure success? What does it look like? The first step to managing performance is to be able to measure it and to effectively gain insights from those measurements and metrics in terms of where the gaps are and how we can use techniques and tools to support the closure of those gaps. Whether we're looking at financial performance, whether we're looking at supply chain KPIs and metrics, or whether we're looking at sustainability KPIs, we do follow a very similar process in terms of how we manage the performance of each of those things. The second piece of the topic today will be around just level setting on some of when we talk about emissions and supply chain management, what does that mean? I think looking at the previous presentations that have been done today already, I can see a lot of detail, and it's very impressive to think that the group here today already has that level of detail and understanding of what emissions are in supply chain, what it means, and specifically around the more hardcore metrics and numbers around these things. Then lastly, what I'd like to do is actually take you through 3 different areas or things that I think can help in terms of setting action plans and steps to improve performance within emissions and sustainability management. So let's dive in. The first table here is actually a representation of attributes and metrics within general supply chain management. So this actually comes from the SCORE model, and the SCORE model undergoes revisions every few years. Right now, the SCORE model, Supply Chain Operations Reference Model, is actually undergoing a revision to incorporate sustainability metrics into the model itself. So what the model does is really combine different aspects. So it looks at the process of the supply chain, plan, source, make, deliver, return, and enable, typical supply chain processes. It looks at the performance attributes that you can see here. It looks at skills, and it looks at practices that can be used to support to the benefit really of the skill of the performance that we want to achieve in the supply chain. So the reason I've shared this is actually because even though you may think, well, reliability, what does that have to do with sustainability? Well, when we think of perfect order fulfillment, there's a certain way to measure that, right? So perfect order fulfillment is a level 1 metric that we use to support reliability in the supply chain. It's made up of level 2 and even level 3 metrics which support that result. But within that, there's various factors, right? And we measure this in a very certain way. And I'll show you some of the examples of this in a moment. But we also need to be measuring things like environmental and social activity within the supply chain. So the last couple of years, I've been working in the demand planning S&OP area, right? That's really my historic career path. And generally, when I started in that time, we were focused on reliability, we were focused on inventory, we were focused on those types of metrics, profitability, of course, and cost and things like that. But as time has gone by, the job has become more difficult because now we don't just have to focus on those things like the resilience attributes and the economic attributes, but also the sustainability attributes. And I'm seeing more and more as I look at S&OP cycles, as I look at enterprise business planning, even systems within the organizations. There's a lot more inputs in terms of the environmental and social metrics and elements that is really driving decisions in the organization. So this is really key and really important to think about, right? So the next SCORE model that will be updated at just in a couple of months' time will actually incorporate sustainability metrics in it as well, which, by the way, will also be benchmarkable. So this is going to be a very interesting thing to look at in the next couple of months. And you can actually go view this yourself, by the way. It's freely available at score.ascm.org. So now thinking about this in terms of when we look at this from a performance point of view, right? We've got the attribute, we've got a metric, and then we need to look at the actual performance of the organization. So just as with any other metric that we would have, we have the same thing from an environmental perspective. A lot of the discussion today is centered around reporting, and reporting of greenhouse gas emissions, for example, is a very important thing and is in some cases mandated within certain industries. But what we actually also want to do is be able to measure and manage that performance. So firstly, understanding what the performance actually is, right? And when we look at this specific example of greenhouse gas emissions, for example, we have scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3. 20 metric tons, 40 metric tons, and 15 metric tons as an example. We also need to have a target, right? Any metric or any kind of performance management process requires targets. We need to know where we're aiming, what we're aiming for, and how to get there. So you can see as an example in this case, our scope 1 metric meets and actually exceeds the target that we had set. We have scope 2 and scope 3, which does not. And in this case, we would recommend that there'd be a next step that would be taken to identify what is making up that gap, the biggest elements of that gap, and how to then go ahead and close the gap, right, as time goes by. When we look at social metrics, just by the way, a lot more difficult generally to measure, but definitely measurable still, right? But that is not necessarily the key topic for today's discussion. So I just want to dive in really quickly just to level set on this, right, from an emissions perspective. So I think the audience here generally is pretty aware of what these mean, but what's important for me is on the right-hand side, right, the calculation or the measurement that is used when we think of these different types of emissions, right, scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3. And this actually comes very, very much out of the GRI, the Global Reporting Initiative, which defines these things in very much detail, right? The GRI also represents very clear calculations and measurements for each of these elements, right? So you know exactly how to measure scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3, and what these different terms mean from the GRI, right? It's GRI 305, I think. So scope 1, just as a level set here, is anything that is emitted from your direct operations in your business, right? So any generation of electricity that is direct at the factory, for example, at your warehouse, any physical processing in the manufacturing plant, any transportation, right, of materials, products, waste, workers, and passengers, and what we call fugitive emissions. So fugitive emissions is really just the like emissions that might escape. So for example, if there's a leak in your truck, right, that could be something that would be termed as a fugitive emission. From a calculation perspective on scope 1, there's many ways to do this calculation. One that is commonly used is called mass balance calculations, which really looks at the inputs and then the outputs within a system and really calculates what's left over or what the result is of that. Site-specific data, really looking at the composition of different types of fuels, what makes up those in terms of the emissions and what types of gases are emitted from those. Calculations based on published criteria such as emission factors, and then what we call the global warming potential, which is the GWP, and then direct measurements of greenhouse gas emissions, for example, continuous online analyzers and estimations, right? Just estimating what you think those numbers could be. Scope 2 relates more to greenhouse gas emissions that are acquired from an external source, but also are used within the organization. So let's say, for example, you purchase an electric vehicle. The electricity that would be assigned to use that electric vehicle really has its own emissions, right? And we know that within South Africa, this is very much the case. Produced electricity is very high on emissions, right? So even if you have an electric vehicle, there is still going to be a scope 2 emission that is going to be resulting from that. There are two generally accepted ways of looking at this from a calculation perspective. The one is location-based, which really reflects an average greenhouse gas emission on the grid, from which your energy is consumed. The other one is market-based, which has definitely got some of its criticisms, but reflects emissions from electricity that the organization has chosen, right? And may look at a specific contract or details within a contract with a supplier that might define what the emissions are from that, right? So this is where the two differ. And then looking at scope 3, this is other indirect source of greenhouse gas emissions that are a result or a consequence of the organization's activities. So this could include things like your producers extracting materials that you use, transporting purchased fuels, for example, in your vehicle. Also what the customer does with your product as an organization. So, for example, how do they dispose of the product? Does that in some way cause emissions, right? How do they use the product itself? And is there an element of that that is causing greenhouse gas emissions? So that is what would be sitting in scope 3. We do have 2 clear categories, which is the upstream categories and downstream categories as well. So looking at upstream from a supply chain perspective, right? Purchased goods and services, the fuel related to activities that are not included within scope 1 and 2, things like employee commuting as well, right? Downstream activities could include things like the processing of sold products, how people use the products that we sell them, and then how they what they do with them at the end of the life or the useful life of those products, right? So these are just examples of the upstream and downstream components that make up all these different areas and these different scopes. Okay. And typically CO2 emissions are measured in metric tons or of a CO2 equivalent, right? So it generally is CO2, but there are obviously other gases as well that exist. So what I want to take you through now is just 3 ways that you can start to manage the performance of greenhouse gas emissions and of really the goal of the target that you want to achieve. Okay. So the first one that I have here is benchmarking. Okay. And what I'm representing here is actually fairly generic from a benchmarking perspective, but this applies absolutely when we look at things like greenhouse gases, right? Looking at, first of all, internal benchmarking. So within the organization that we operate in, are we looking at various different functional areas or different groups or different geographic areas, for example, within the company or within companies within the group of companies? So this is what we would look at doing, is saying which of these entities or organizations within the company is actually delivering the highest benefit or is causing the most destruction from a emissions perspective. So this is one piece that we can do from an internal benchmarking point of view. Secondly, we can look at external benchmarking. So we actually do this quite a lot at ASCM. And with the new score model that is coming out in the next few months, we will also be incorporating benchmarking from a sustainability perspective too. This most likely will happen from the GRI. So Global Reporting Initiative does have a lot of data already, and we have other sources of data that we were using for this. Much like, for example, if you were to do a benchmarking on reliability or cost or agility within the supply chain, you as an organization would want to know, how well do we think we're performing when compared to our peers or when compared to other entities that we want to be similar to or that we strive to achieve results like? The second important part of benchmarking is to really define where we want to be, right? Do we want to be at a superior level when it comes to a specific attribute? So for example, if we look at emissions specifically, we have various different types of pollution and types of sustainable elements. If emissions is that part of the metric that we want to focus on, then we'd actually want to be at a superior level when compared to the competitors, when compared to the industry benchmark. So it's really important to also look at a target level of performance for each of those things, right? Look at the organization's performance, and then of course the gap to the target, okay? None of this is really worthwhile unless we are taking action once we know what the gap is versus where we want to be. So really, as a next step coming out of any benchmarking exercise is to set targets, review, learn, and adjust. Look at what we've done, right? Look at what the impact is of that action, and then to actually readjust and see how we can get better and improve. This is very commonly done with a root cause analysis, which I will talk about next. So RCCA, absolutely one of my favorite topics within supply chain management. What I see quite a lot is the RC being done very well, So people identifying the root cause for something that's gone wrong in the supply chain, or something that is, away from the target when we think of sustainability even. But the corrective action piece, which is so important to take note of and to actually define and to do. So the first step, knowing our numbers and understanding exactly where we are and where we sit, right, either through an internal benchmark, a target, or an external benchmark, is to identify those areas that we can improve on. Define and describe those root causes, and then identify potential solutions that could solve that. Sometimes those solutions come with a cost, and that's where we need to really balance that cost and effort required to select an appropriate solution. The next thing would be to define the people responsible, the timeline, and the expected impact of that solution that we are putting in place. Any of these typically should be a project or some sort of small initiative, but does need to have those very, very clear defined people, timelines, and expected impact. I've seen this kind of topic from a sustainability perspective more incorporated as time goes by into an S&OP cycle. So providing actions, looking at what the opportunities are and the impact of those actions, and really going back to that every month in the S&OP cycle, once hopefully the corrective actions have been implemented. So of course, if we're not meeting the performance objective, we have to go back to the solution. If we're meeting the performance objective, then let's review the results that we get and hopefully achieve that sustained business result. I always hope for this in a S&OP meeting, that we are going to define new problems and see new issues with metrics, but hopefully it's not the same issue, right, that is causing it. And that would be a really good star, gold star on the people that are doing the right things to solve the problems and to make sure that those things don't happen again. Lastly, I know we are running out of time as well here. So lastly, I'd just like to share with you some of the other more long-term strategic areas that we can focus on as supply chain professionals when we think of how to support our sustainability journeys, right? And specifically around emissions in this case. So the first one that I just want to focus on a little bit is determine the strategic direction on emissions management. So a lot of organizations these days are actually doing reports. So usually it's annually, sometimes it's every 2 years. I see a lot of sustainability reports that come out. But what's really important for the organization, I think, is to have that strategic approach. First of all, what is it that we want to do? And be very definitive with that and do it on purpose, right? If we're following an informal approach, for example, if we say, well, we don't really care that much if we reduce the CO2 emissions, this might be something that a company actually has said, right? It's not something that they think about that much, but I guarantee you that most organizations are going to be doing something. Emissions compensation through carbon credits. So that's saying, well, we can still pollute, but we will just solve the problem by buying carbon credits. We may or may not be aligned with science. And also what we see a lot is marketing or PR driven. So doing sustainable things, having initiatives that are really just marketing driven and really based on what basically the sales of the consumers want them to do or expect them to do. The other one that actually happens a lot is really just from a cost saving perspective. Let's reduce emissions, and it's really just a byproduct of wanting to save cost, right? The less vehicle routes we do, the less emissions we have, right? So if we can be more efficient, of course, that's also going to reduce the emissions. But that's just a byproduct, essentially. Then carbon neutral science-based. This is saying we will not emit CO2, or we'll try not to. We'll counterbalance this when it's unavoidable and we have to actually emit something. And also we want to set science-based targets for the next 5 to 10 years. So I actually do a lot of work in Saudi Arabia, and in Saudi Arabia, they have Vision 2030. Within Vision 2030, they've aligned to the SDGs of the United Nations. And within that is some very clear goals and directions, specifically for targets on emissions, sustainability targets, and these types of things which are bundled into that. But every entity should have something in place that gives them a strategic direction. The ultimate goal is net zero, right? So that's saying we will not emit any of the key 7 greenhouse gases. We would counterbalance this when unavoidable and really try and focus on indirect emissions. So the scope 2 and 3, not just scope 1. And of course, set the science-based targets for the 5 to 10 year range. Okay. And I think it was mentioned actually in one of the previous presentations about the Race to Zero, which is zero emissions by 2050. This is a sort of a worldwide target that people are aiming to achieve. The other thing to look at is when we should be striving really for ecological excellence. So it's not only about the calculation of these emissions that we make, it's also about what the broader picture is in terms of what our goal is from a strategic perspective when we think of ecological excellence. So we've actually defined this within ASCM. We do have a set of standards that exist and really covers this in the ecological excellence area. So energy, water, and waste is sort of the least complex, right? It's like measuring what we've done, measuring the amount of energy we use, the water we use, and the waste we produce. Material usage and restrictions. So that's what materials are we actually using in the products that we sell, what is restricted, and how do we best optimize those from a sustainability perspective. Moving in then to a climate strategy. So this is almost a more purposeful direction for the organization, thinking about what it is we want to do from a climate strategy perspective. Moving then into product lifecycle stewardship, right? And I know the example for this is really always about electric vehicles, right? Saying, okay, it's, the electric vehicle as its own entity is really not bad for the environment at all. But let's think about this whole entire supply chain in terms of the manufacturing, the raw materials that are required for that manufacturing process, the impact of that manufacturing process, some of the utilization factors within when people actually use that vehicle, and of course, the destruction and disposal of that at the end of its useful life. What happens to the battery of the electric vehicle once the product is over, right? Once we don't need it anymore. So many examples like this exist, and product lifecycle management for me is a very, very important topic because it shows the trade-offs between different areas of the supply chain. And then the ultimate goal is circular economy, right? One man's trash is another man's gold. Using byproducts from certain industries as an input into another. So this is an example of where, I think people are striving for, and it's definitely very complex, but there are entities and organizations that are trying to move to this as we go through the journey. Watching the trends is another thing that obviously, we should all be doing to make sure that we are striving towards less carbon emissions and all these, right? But some of the current trends that we have seen is within the US, for example, global greenhouse gas emissions reporting is becoming mandatory to all public companies. So this is important, and I think something that will be more applicable as we look at other markets in the future. We have the Europe Green Deal, which is carbon neutrality by 2050. And industry-specific trends. For example, in the fashion industry, we are seeing these sort of trends happen, and specifically in industries where we see a lot of this kind of greenhouse gas emissions and the impact of that being quite a lot. And then finally, the implementation of standards and alignment to business processes. So we do have actually a set of standards as the Association of Supply Chain Management, looking at various parts of sustainability in a broad sense. But this is important, I think, to consider, right? And many people do implement, ISO standards and these sort of things, which is fantastic. And what we're saying is you need a basis for which to do these things, right? How do we improve our sustainability journey? What is the reference point that we're using to do that? So there are many options and available solutions for entities around the world to do that. So you could actually download this as well if you want. I know that's a bit of a product placement on my part, but you can actually download the set of standards that ASCM has got and really just understand this model a bit better because there's a lot of details in this. But I do want to say thank you. I wanted to just really quickly show you all of these different elements, how we think of it from a performance management perspective and what things we can do. And I'd like to say thank you so much for everybody there, and back to you, Liesl.
Great, Grant. Thank you so much. Paul, are you still in the audience? I think we can do a quick questions and answers session. So, Grant, one of the questions from Gordon was, can you expand on net zero? Does this mean absolutely no emissions or balance between emissions and carbon capture?
Yes, sure. So, I mean, the goal is, and this is really applicable. It reminds me of an example, right? And let me use the example and then explain, I think, the sort of the answer to that. I was looking at, there was a big organization, a retailer that is currently giving out these little free, it's like little products, right? And they say that these are recycled products, right? That's made from recycled materials. So they're little toys that you can get at the supermarket. But we're still using a production process to make those things, even though they are recycled. So the best way for us to actually go about this is to say, let's not even do it. Let's not even create the emission where that is possible. The goal is net zero. The goal is zero, should I say. When we say net zero, we're netting it out by doing some other things where it's not possible yet to create zero carbon emissions. So the end result is a net zero, but that does not necessarily mean that there will be no carbon emissions that will be produced from the process.
All right, super. Just one more question, and it's from Beverly, which is quite interesting, about that she's recently seen the size of packaging double, which has a green impact in terms of space when you're transporting. And, she's just wondering if brand managers are also included in transport sustainability discussions, when it comes to stuff like packaging design, etc. So I guess her question, and it's probably a rhetorical question, is where's the consistency and accountability? So I think there are so many partners within a supply chain context, and as a transporter, you at the end, you're just transporting the product. So I think there's a lot of considerations that need to be made all the way upstream to downstream to ensure that the goods are moved as efficiently as possible. Okay, Paul, there's some questions for you in the chat as well. One from Gordon again. He said, given that biofuels require significant agricultural land take, unless they are marine derived, how is consideration given to the impacts on both food security and biodiversity loss, which is now being recognized as a threat as significant as climate change? Any views on that?
Yes, I think that is the reason for my sort of concluding remark on biofuels, and that it's likely to be limited in the long run by the availability of biomass, and that availability is determined by, amongst other things, the food versus fuel kind of debate, and also the ecological aspects, biodiversity and so on are becoming more and more prominent in the debate. And are featuring in making those kind of decisions. So those are the kind of things that will ultimately probably limit biomass as a primary energy source for fuels.
Okay, super. Are there any questions from the floor or any hands or people that like to ask questions to any of our presenters today before we close up?
They're welcome to unmute. Yeah, they either put up a hand or unmute. We can see when somebody unmutes, and then we can recognize the person.
God, I don't see any. No, I think everyone's happy at least. Grant, thank you so much. I often get this question: how do you measure? Yes. See. Lady, do you want to ask your question quickly?
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for the great presentations. Paul, I've just been wondering, in terms like in the transport sector, when we're looking at how we can reduce the emissions, what has been like a larger influence compared to like comparing between the efficiency of all the fuels that we possibly can use versus the end goal of making the sector a bit more environmentally friendly?
I'm going to try and answer your question. I'm not sure how successful I'll be. I think you may have gathered from my presentation that there's no low-hanging fruit here. There's no easy solution to do this. And all of the really impactful solutions are longer-term solutions. And they either mean, turning over to a new type of vehicle technology or establishing a whole new supply system for a fuel such as for hydrogen and so on. So in the short term, probably the most, the greatest impact is to keep up with the latest vehicle technology because, fuel efficiency is improving all the time as vehicle technology progresses. And I think that's one of the factors. And then operational efficiency is probably also a huge lever, depending on what your baseline is. Yeah, from a fuels perspective, it's I think the crystal ball is still very, very blurry, and how this is all going to pan out we're going to see in the next decade or two.
Fantastic. Thank you, Paul. Any other questions from the floor? Okay, super. Grant, thank you so much. I often do get asked, it's one of the biggest questions that come up, how do you tackle this supply chain emissions measurement, because it's broad and there's so many players. So it's great that there's a framework that people could use, and I encourage everyone to go onto your website and have a look further. So thank you for your time and your insights. And Paul, thank you for your technical expertise in this the big gray areas of alternative fuel. I mean, it is something that, is important for our industry to understand in the technical side of things. So I really, really thank you again for your time and your input. And I don't know if Ritametsi is still on the call, but I mean, scenario planning is critical. Is how do we see where we're going? What do we need to do? And what opportunities are there in order for us to reach this big goal of net zero by 2050? So thank you very much. We were delighted to have you at our session this morning. And I guess it's over to you, Harry.
Liesl, thank you very much. And thank you to our panelists. And I would like to thank Liesl especially for the excellent MC work you've done. Liesl also has played an instrumental role in putting together this program for us. So Liesl, thank you so very much for all the preparations and guidance. And we really appreciate you doing your passion for the industry and what you do, and also what Unitrans is doing, and for Unitrans hosting this event today. So we thank you very much, and we look forward to be working with you again in future. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Harry. Thank you so much. Bye, everyone.